Okie dokie. So let's get started. 1 second here. Perfect. Okay. So this is Apologetics 202, class number 1. So this is a recording. Blank room today, but that's fine because it is Good Friday. So hopefully everybody's out there with family and friends and celebrating Good Friday. So for those that have not seen this video or this particular class, this is a review class. We were not recording at the time when we did the class originally, so I'm basically going to just review this information, record it so that we have a sequential class for future use. So Apologetics 202, youtube.com/@CityTeamTeach if you want to get all of the videos in this series and future series. They will be available there and put online. So today the agenda is we're going to be talking about 3 main arguments for the existence of God. So obviously the class has to start with a foundation of, is there even a God? And if so, then what are we going to do about it? But first, we have to establish there is. And if there's not, then there's not much to do about it. So 3 arguments for the existence of God. And we're going to get into a very quick prophecy. So this is a pretty cool thing. And we'll talk about why prophecy is even needed. So, all right, so let's dig in. Arguments for God. So the first one that we're going to go over is going to be the moral argument for God, okay? The second one is basically, it's a little complicated, but it's the KALAM cosmological argument, right? And then the third and final one is the ontological argument, right? And so the ontological argument is the most complicated of the 3. So we will basically go from easiest. Now, obviously, certain people will push back against these arguments as we go along, but we're going to go from what I think is the easiest to understand and present to probably the most complicated. And then, like I said, we'll get into just a quick prophecy today. So this class will most likely be a little shorter than normal as we don't have feedback today. We don't have people questioning and that kind of thing. I will try to present some questions, objections, and things like that as we go along, just so that we have, some interaction and some concept of what the arguments might be, right? So I'm going to go through these things and present what are called syllogisms, okay? And basically a syllogism is an outline of if this, then this, then this, right? It's sort of a summary statement of the concept that is being presented as the argument here. So the first one that we're going to deal with, like I said, it's the moral argument for the existence of God. And if we're going to be dealing with the syllogism for that, it goes like this. Good is, we're actually going to present the argument, I apologize, and then I'm going to present the syllogism as a summary in this case. So good is not the same thing as moral, right? You can become a doctor and you can do good things, but that is not a moral requirement, right? And there's a big difference between moral requirements and just doing good. You see, people will argue that there's basically no moral requirements, but that we are designed to do good to one another. But that's not the same thing. You see, even C.S. Lewis, who obviously is a Christian apologetics expert, wrote way back in, wrote Mere Christianity and a few other books that I would recommend you check out. But even he, as an anthropologist, so an anthropologist is somebody who studies human behavior, right? And so even he said that across all humans of all different cultures and things like that, there's this moral code, like do not murder, right? We all agree torturing little children for fun is evil. It's morally evil, right? It's not being good to not do that, right? It's a moral imperative not to do that. That's a very different thing than being good to help somebody who skinned their knee by putting a Band-Aid on. That's good, but it's not moral, right? And so all people of all time and all cultures have this knowledge, this innate knowledge, I would say the knowledge of God's law written on their heart. Of course, other people would push back on that to say, no, it's just nature, right? It's just the success of the species, which we'll talk about why that falls apart pretty quickly. So that's the peoples across all cultures or times have knowledge of moral good. Okay? Then the third is natural processes cannot lead to a moral good or evil. And so this is the pushback on that, right? So they're going to say, well, you know, we say, okay, why is it important to do good? Why is it important to have moral good? And they would say, well, you know, the success of our species. And I would push back on that and say, okay, what makes our species better than any other species? Why is it moral good that our species succeeds and say cockroaches or rats or whatever isn't going to succeed over us? Like we kill rats and cockroaches and things like that all the time, right? So why is it ours versus theirs? Now you would push back and say sentient life, but again, if it's natural processes, that's just an accident, right? So there's much more to that, and we all agree that there is much more to that. In fact, if it was just natural processes, then the definition of good and evil is completely subjective. My natural process to determine that, you know, torturing little children is evil should not be consistent across all cultures of all times. Why? Because that's just my natural process. It should be different for somebody else with a different natural process, a different set of chemistry and neurons and things like that. But it's not. It's a moral constant, all right? So some of the other things that we can do to like see this is we can present examples, right? So for example, if the Nazis won World War II and they convinced everyone in the world that what they did was okay, right? That really still wouldn't make it morally okay, right? Like we would all say what the Nazis did when they murdered people and they put them in concentration camps and these kinds of things, torturing people, children, men, women, that was morally evil, right? Now I'm sure in their own mind they were convinced that it was okay, or at least some of them were. I genuinely believe most of them didn't, unless they were psychopathic. But, right, as a rule, even if they were successful and conquered the entire world and we all became, quote, Nazis, it still wouldn't make it morally right. And that's the difference. They can say, oh, it's good, it's fine, but it's not morally right. And we all know that. And so that's where we have to say, okay, there must be some objective to base this off of. It's not a subjective thing where we can decide, oh, okay, it's morally okay for me to steal and kill and all this stuff. No, objectively, that's why we punish people, right? Because people do go out there and they say, oh, well, you know, I think it's okay for me to, you know, steal things or murder people or whatever, right? But as a country and as a world and things like that, like every country on the planet has rules against these moral issues, these moral evils. Why? Because it's an objective truth, not a subjective one. So, you know, ironically, people will actually make this argument for you, even in their rebuttals, right? So they'll say, well, you're not being very tolerant of other ideas, right? Like you're you know, spouting your ideas and you're very hard line and it's this way and that has to be this way or it's not right. And then they'll say, well, this isn't being very tolerant of other ideas. Now, obviously, this is a circular reasoning, right? But, and people will dismiss this argument, but here's the thing, what they miss sometimes, right, when we just dismiss this argument, which we should out of hand, any circular reasoning like that, saying, oh, you're not being tolerant is in of itself being intolerant of the, quote, intolerance. It's a ridiculous argument. However, when we look at it, what you are missing here is that they have some idea or concept of some truth that is outside of themselves. They say, well, it's not just me that thinks that what you're saying isn't a good idea. It's a lot of people think it's not a good idea and therefore it should not be tolerated. Now, obviously that's ridiculous, but it does adhere to something that they're making this objective argument that they're trying to, they're trying to appeal, as we call it, to a higher authority, right? They're appealing to some idea that there is some objective truth and that you are violating it. So even in their own arguments against it, they will actually present the argument. Now, of course, they won't see it like that at first, and that's why they'll say things like this, which, of course, is perfect when you're trying to have these debates and arguments. And again, remember when I say the term argument, it's not like we use that term in the colloquial sense, right? It's not just, oh, I'm fighting with somebody, right? We're presenting a reasoning, logical explanation for our belief system. That's what we use the term argument for in like higher education, right? So obviously that will disagree with people, but it doesn't have to be a fight as we would colloquially use the term argument today. So now we've sort of presented some of the basic concepts of the moral argument. So let's get into, again, the syllogism. And as I've mentioned, the syllogism is, again, it's just basically the summary of this, then this, then this, right? Sort of the proof, if you will, if you're familiar with mathematical terms. So the first part of the syllogism is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, right? So if, again, this goes back to the natural processes. If all things are natural processes, natural chemical processes, then there's no way to say your natural chemical process that turns you into this evil monster is less good than this natural process which tells me that that's evil, right? There's no comparison. Why is that good? Why is that evil? There isn't. Or why vice versa? There's no objective way to say that. So there are no objective moral values and duties. Now, this is the other thing. So duties is this imperative that we have. You see, if someone were to walk in on basically someone murdering a child or raping a child, right? It would be our moral duty to actually interface with that and say, no, stop. Sorry, interfere. It would be our moral duty to stop that. And if we were to stand by to watch, what happens? Well, we become an accessory. So we are held accountable in this duty to moral objective truth. Give me just a second. I'm going to kind of close the door just a little bit if there's some noise in the hallway here. Sorry about that. One moment. Just going to shut it a little bit here so people can still come in if they desire. Okay, sorry. So that's the first point of the syllogism. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Okay? Now, we all agree objective moral values and duties do exist. Now, people will try to push back on this, but reality is in our heart of hearts, we know these things. And most people don't try to push back on this. If I ask people, is it okay to murder and rape little children? Of course, 99.9999% of people in the entire world is going to say no. And even those people that do it actually know it's wrong. That's why they try to hide it. That's why they're not just open about it, because they know it's wrong. And so we know objective moral values and duties do exist. Okay? So if God does not exist, then objective values and duties do not exist. But we know objective moral values and duties do exist, so that contradicts point 1. So that brings us to point 3. Therefore, God exists. Because we have to have something outside of humans to give us this objective truth. Something outside of ourselves that's not reliant on our natural processes, that is consistent across the board. So this is the moral argument for God. Now, we're not making the argument for Jesus yet, right? We're not making necessarily the argument for the God of the Bible, per se. We're just saying there is a God out there, right? Now, some people might say, well, could be more than one God. Well, in this particular argument, that's technically true. But we're going to present other arguments that would contradict that and explain why they all mesh together. So, excuse me, the first one, as I said, is the moral argument. And now we're going to go ahead and dive into the KALAM cosmological argument. And now, as I mentioned, this is a little bit more complicated to understand. So we are going to start with the syllogism in this case, and then sort of break it down so that it's easier to understand. So whatever begins to exist has a cause, okay? That's a simple. Now I put this in here. We don't get something from nothing, right? I can't just hold my hand out that has nothing in it, and then poof, all of a sudden I've got this in there, right? It's like magic. But it doesn't work that way. We all know that. There's scientific, objective, verifiable evidence that says we never get something from nothing. It's impossible. In fact, nature abhors a vacuum. That's a law, right? We know that. So when there is nothing, something is pulled into it, not the other way around. Not nothing and then something's pulled out of it. It's nothing and something's pulled into it. So we all know whatever begins to exist has a cause, okay? So we also know the universe began to exist, okay? Now, I'm going to go over why we know some of these things. But I'm going to start with, again, the syllogism, and then we'll go deeper into how we know that these things are a legitimate argument or syllogism. The universe began to exist, right? So if the universe began to exist, therefore, it must have a cause. So there must be something that caused the something from the nothing. You can't have that without a cause. So whatever this cause is, that must be spaceless because we exist in space. It must be timeless because we are captured by time. And so therefore, whatever it is must be outside of time. It must be immaterial because the material world that it created would have to then exist only because it's immaterial, right? You can't, like, we are material beings. We only create material things, right? We cannot create, like, life, for example, which is something immaterial. So in this case, it must be immaterial. It also must be uncaused. Now, this is important, right? Because as we established in point 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause, except the thing that can't have a cause, because whatever doesn't have a cause must be God. And it must be immensely powerful. This cause must be God, right? And so here's the thing. This is where I said we'll present an argument that will sort of mesh with the moral argument to imply that there can only be one God. And this is this argument. You see, if there's a God that was created, whatever created that God must be God. And if that God was created, then that thing that created it must be God. And so on and so on and so on until you have this regressive infinity, which is obviously impossible. At some point, there must be that cause, right? And so whatever that is, that starting point, nothing before it can be caused, or that would be God. And so therefore, it all comes down to a single point. And that single point, therefore a single God, is what must exist as God. And this is the basis of this argument. Now, obviously, there's a lot of pushback on this argument. This is actually one of the most debated arguments. I don't really have, without people here, it's really difficult to sort of present the arguments for this. But the basic concept, or at least the biggest rebuttal that I've heard to this particular one, is that, well, we are inside the universe, so we only know what it's like inside our universe, the laws of our universe. Well, okay, yes, that's true. And then they'll say, well, so it could be that there's something outside of our universe that doesn't follow these rules, right? Something could come from nothing outside of the rules of the universe. Well, okay, but here's the problem. That's not observable, right? You're speculating, right? And so if you're going to speculate, then the only speculation that makes sense is that whatever that is, whatever's outside of our universe that is being able to create it, then therefore must be God. You're not making an argument that there is no God. You're simply arguing that we don't understand the rules of the universe, which I would actually agree with. We do not understand the rules of the universe because we're not capable of understanding all the rules of the universe, because it's created by this being so much greater and more powerful than us. I mean, we don't even understand the human body fully. How could we possibly be expected to understand the entire universe? I mean, there's consistently astrologers and physicists and things like that, even like Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Like these guys who are clearly not Christian, who will say things like, well, it's one of the greatest mysteries of the universe how stars came into existence, or how moons came into existence, or how galaxies came into existence. Why? Because they don't know. And why do they not know? Because they don't have some sort of concrete foundation in what I would argue is the biblical God, right? Now, we'll establish why I think it's the biblical God later, but at least having some foundation in a creator and a God would explain these things, and they can't accept that, so therefore they have no explanation. Their argument will be, well, we'll find out eventually. Yep, I agree, you will find out eventually. So, let's talk about the KALAM argument, the cosmological argument, and how we know the universe has a beginning. So, these are scientific facts, right? So, it's running out of energy, right? So, you may have heard this before in that we are going to, as a universe and as a species, as existence, will cease to exist by what we call heat death, right? So if it was as old as they say it was, we would have already run out. You see, there's a constant rate of heat loss and energy loss in this universe. It's observable, and that's why we can predict when the heat death will happen. So by this math, if you take that back to the originating point, you would find out, well, wait a second, something's wrong here. And so what they'll say is, well, it didn't start to lose energy, right? Or part of this, in part 2 here, the second section, is the concept of what's called inflation. So I'm going to tie these in here real quick together, and then we're going to talk about them both sort of simultaneously, because this theory of inflation really does help sort of explain both of these reasons why it doesn't really make any sense, right? So science has proven a singularity, meaning a single point of beginning at which the universe expanded from, right? This is, in some arguments, they'll say it's the Big Bang, right? Now, they don't explain where the stuff came from for the Big Bang, right? They just, oh, there was just some stuff, and then it exploded, it got really hot, and energy, and boom, and then explosion, right? Well, the problem is that with the way that the universe is expanding, right, we know that this Big Bang doesn't really make any sense. And so what they'll say is, oh, well, what we have is this inflation, right? And so basically there's this time period right after the creation, right, in this case, the Big Bang, where it just rapidly expanded, and then all of a sudden it slowed down for no particular reason. Right? That's the problem. And even, again, astrophysicists and things like that will say one of the biggest problems with the Big Bang Theory, and these are people that are not Christian, okay? You can look up these sources on your own, Google it up, and you'll find that there are astrophysicists in well-known scientific colleges that are saying one of the biggest problems is in the theory of inflation. There's no explanation for it. It's just a thought process, and because there's no evidence for it, it doesn't fit what we see. And so it's this same concept. Well, there was this time where we had more energy. Now we have this decaying rate that wasn't the consistent. I mean, it's been consistent for as long as we can measure it, but it wasn't consistent before, right? These concepts that don't really match up with scientific evidence, right? And that's because, again, if you come at it with the idea already, there cannot be a God, you must come up with explanations that leave God out. Whereas the logical explanations go directly in tie with there is a God. And so that's why we have these pushbacks. Now, this is an extremely complicated argument, and I don't have the time to, I mean, it would take probably 2-3 hours just to present all of the sides of this argument. So I just wanted to give you the concept, the understanding of this argument, hopefully as simply as possible, and some very sort of basic argument points that you might hear from the other side of this argument, so that you'll know at least how to sort of at least have the conversation. So that is the KALAM cosmological argument. So we know that the universe has a beginning, it's running out of energy, and science has proven it's coming from a singular point. And this goes back to that whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? It all came from a central point, a singularity there. So let's go on to the ontological argument. Now, this is the most complicated argument, and it's probably one of the oldest documented arguments for God. And it's a really serious thought experiment. It's really abstract, and so needs some serious time. But basically, we are going to, again, start with the syllogism and then hopefully break that down. So the syllogism starts with the concept of a maximally great being is self-consistent. In other words, it's not illogical, okay? And we'll talk about that in a second. If the concept of a maximally great being is self-consistent, then there is at least one logically possible world in which a maximally great being exists. All right, and again, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to break it down into what I would consider maybe a little easier to understand, okay? Therefore, there is at least one logically possible world in which a maximally great being exists. And these look similar, right? But it's saying if it's possible that it's self-consistent, or it's not self-consistent, I guess, then there's at least one logically possible world. And if there's one logically possible world, there is one possible world, okay? If a maximally great being exists in one logically possible world, it exists in every logical possible world. And then finally, therefore, a maximally great being, that is God, exists in every logically possible world. Now, this is, again, at the surface, it seems complicated and ridiculous in some ways. But let's break it down. So let's put it in a way that we can understand, okay? So if I say, let's imagine, okay, again, this is a thought process, right? It is a thought experiment, not a, like, I'm writing down things and you're reading it like a material exercise, right? It's a little abstract, but it actually makes logical sense and really does make a fantastic argument for the existence of God. So imagine it like this, okay? And I'm gonna say this whole thing in a much simpler way. Basically, if God could exist, then he does exist and he must exist, right? And that's basically what this is all saying in a nutshell. So now explain what that means. So, for example, it is possible that a unicorn exists in some world. Why? Because it's not logically inconsistent, right? So it's not impossible for a unicorn to possibly exist in some universe. Again, this is thought experiment. We're not necessarily saying multiple universes exist or multiple worlds exist, but we're simply saying in our thought experiment, let's imagine that there are multiple universes, multiple worlds, and there are different variations of things. So a unicorn could possibly exist in one of these worlds because it's not illogical. It's not logically inconsistent. Whereas, for example, a single married man or a married bachelor, for example, is logically inconsistent, right? You cannot be married and a bachelor. It's logically inconsistent, right? So a married bachelor is not going to exist in any world, right? Even if they call it by some other name, right? Even if they, have a different language or whatever, that concept cannot exist in any world because it's logically inconsistent. Well, a unicorn is logically consistent, right? The smell of the color blue, well, that's logically inconsistent, right? That it's blue, it's a color, it doesn't have a smell, right? And we're not talking about synesthesia, if you know what that is, but it's not really a part of this conversation. But it doesn't have an actual smell, right? So that's a logically inconsistent thing, so it can't be in somewhere else. Now, some people argue, well, the smell of blue could exist in some other world, and okay, but not really, because just because you call something a different name doesn't mean the concept of that is changed, right? A rose by any other name is still a rose, right? And so that's kind of the fallacy of that pushback or that criticism. Now, this again is pointing it into, okay, well, a unicorn could exist, right? A pizza the size of a mountain could exist, right? But more importantly, a maximally good being could exist. There's no logical inconsistency with believing the God that we believe in, the God of goodness, who's maximally good, could exist. Now, here's the thing. So that's a logically consistent statement, but in order for something to be maximally good, it must exist in all worlds, or it's not maximally good. You see, the term maximally good implies that it has to be the highest possible good. And if that's the case, then if there was something gooder, which I know is not a word, but better, right, in another world, then that thing would be the maximally good thing, right? So in order to be maximally good, it must exist in all the worlds, right? It has to. Otherwise, it can't be the maximally good. So that means even in these theoretical worlds, it has to exist. But more importantly, in our actual world, it has to exist, right? So that's this argument in a nutshell. Now, this is an extremely complicated argument, so I apologize, but hopefully that breaks it down in a way that's simple to understand. So let's get into some criticism, okay? Because I can see one right away that pops up. So, well, with that thought process, that could apply to anything, except can it really? Let's think about that, right? So we're saying a maximally good being exists, right? So it's the top thing, right? Well, that doesn't really apply to anything else. For example, if I was to say, there's a maximally good pizza, right? Well, that's not really a thing, is it? Because you could always add another pepperoni. Oh, like it's the biggest pizza that exists. Okay, but it could be bigger. You could have more cheese. You could have more pepperoni or whatever it is that you like on your pizza, right? You could always add more, right? So it's an infinitely regressive or progressive, depending on how you see it, fallacy. A maximally large or a maximally good pizza doesn't exist. It's actually logically inconsistent. But a maximally good being is not inconsistent. And so that's the thing. When we apply this, and this is what's really cool about this argument, is if we apply this to things that we understand in our human world, it actually doesn't apply. It can only apply to things outside of our human world. Things that must be greater than human beings. You see, we can't apply it to a desk or a TV or any of the material things that we see, the natural things that we see. That's where, when we start to break this down, we go, oh, okay, that makes way more sense. So, God in definition, right? So that's what the ontological word is. It just means by definition demands his existence. And this is what I was talking about. By saying a maximally good being is a logically consistent thing that could exist, by definition, it does exist. This is a really awesome, clever argument that was presented, and I don't want to misstate this, but I think it was presented in the 1700s. I could be wrong. It could be much further back than that originally. I'm sorry, I don't think I have the date on that. But so now that I've presented 3 arguments, and in the next class, if you're watching online, that's class number 2. They're going to have numbers, right? I present another argument, and then in class 3, I present, I think, a 5th. So I eventually present 5 arguments, but I am not going to present more than 3 today, mainly because, again, it is so much and it's so complicated and abstract. Like, I don't want to overwhelm your brain and trying to grasp onto these concepts. Hopefully, they're broken down enough that we can understand them easily, but there we go. So we've presented 3 arguments for the existence of God. I think all 3 provide solid evidence that there is a God, a single God at that. So now the question is, okay, if we establish that there is a God, well then what do we do about it? Some people say, okay, there's a God, so what, right? Other people will say, well, there's a God, I better do something about it. So through these arguments, and others like it, like I said, I'll present 2 more, one in each of the next classes. You can see those online already. But through these arguments and others like it, I came to believe in the existence of a single God, right? So I was, in fact, raised in a church and a Christian background and things like that. But I wanted to be sure, as I was raised in a very educated household, I wanted to be sure, my parents had encouraged me to, challenge, to question, to make this God, my God, and not just the God of my parents and my forefathers, right? But rather that I need to question and come to the conclusion of my own that there is in fact a God. And so by doing this, I came to say, well, I think these arguments are really compelling arguments for the existence of a God. Well, now what? So now I had to choose the religion that worships that God. You say, well, why? Well, because unfortunately, if I'm as logical as I try to be, I must therefore say, well, this God, did he try to teach me something? Did he try to, encourage me to be better or worse, or he just doesn't care, right? Are we talking about deism where God created the world and he just walked away? Well, I don't think so. I mean, the argument from fine-tuning would argue that that's not the case. So I should give glory and honor and worship to this God that created me. He didn't have to create me. So if he did, then it seems like a moral duty or responsibility to find the correct religion that, as closely as possible, worships said God. So I start to come to the conclusion that, well, I'm really only left with 3 potential religions, right? So by establishing that there is, in fact, only one God, that by definition excludes almost all of the world religions except for 3. And so I'm now left with Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, really. Those are my choices, right? So I have something that I think can help me there. But the first thing I have to do is, okay, well, which one should I discover? And I say, okay, well, let's look at the works, I would say the Bible in this case, but let's look at what they say are their religious texts and see if there's any information there that I can glean to establish which of these I should follow. So by default, in my background being admitted, I obviously am thinking, well, I should go to the Bible. But even the Quran, right? I should be able to look in the Quran and see if that's, something that I should look at. So after doing some research, and basically it came down to this: the Quran doesn't believe that Jesus was God. And so I say, well, okay, all I have to do to determine which of these faiths to go by is determine whether or not Jesus, the historical figure, which this isn't a debate that Jesus existed. Everybody knows there's a man named Jesus and he existed. The only real question now is Jesus God? But how do I determine that? Well, Christianity and Judaism has the Bible. Their religious text is the Bible. So let's determine if I can discover if it's something that this God that we have established exists, if it's something he would use to speak. Now, there's different ways for us to determine that, right? But one of the biggest ways, I think, is going to be prophecy. And so we're going to dig into prophecy because guess what? Almost no religious texts ever have prophecy. There's only a few. And why? Because prophecy is such an objective way to tell whether you've actually got something from God or you're making it up. All right. And so this would contradict things like the Mormon Church, right? Like the founder of the Mormon Church makes a prophecy. It doesn't come true. We can establish this was a man, not somebody from God. Same for the Jehovah's Witness group, right? They make these prophecies and they clearly don't come true over and over and over. In fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses group or organization has said, hey, stop making prophecies because every time we make one, it doesn't come true and it makes us look bad because it is bad. And so very few people will even bother to make prophecy. So let's look at those that do and see if it's evidentially true or not. And if it's not, then let's move on to the next thing. So I've got some rules though, right? Because the rules of prophecy can't just be crazy stuff, right? Like, so for example, it must be specific or not vague, right? So I can't be like looking at Nostradamus. People will say Nostradamus, for example, was a prophet. You should totally listen to what he says. But if anybody's ever tried to actually read Nostradamus, you'll find that it's so incredibly vague and unspecific that people will twist things and literally use the exact thing that he wrote to predict like 5 different things, right? It's like, there will be 2 ancient leaders who go to gold and cat. And you're like, what? What? It doesn't make sense. But then people will take that and will say, oh, okay, well, the cat represents Egypt, but then there were 2 leaders and one was gold. And they try to piece it to fit what is clearly just random sentences wrote out. Like there's no consistency at all. And then they'll take that same thing and apply it in multiple different places, right? So that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about vague stuff, right? Now, poetic is fine, right? But not ambiguous. So I've given this example in class too. And so I said, basically, for example, I could say this in a poem, right? Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm going to hit Max, and so are you. Now that's prophetic, right? It's potentially it's prophetic. Like, okay, I'm going to hit Max. Max is going to get hit in the future. This is prophetic, and so we basically establish poetic, but still not ambiguous, not vague, right? So number one, must be specific. Number two, must be long-term. Now, why would I say that? So short-term prophecy, it is helpful for the people that were in that time, right? If you're looking at a prophecy that was, say, 1,500 years ago, or say 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, you could say, well, how do I know, it says it was written 20 years before this event happened, but how do I know that it wasn't actually written right after it happened, right? So it'd be like me going outside, sitting out there, looking up, waiting, and then it starts to rain, and then me going, hey, I made it rain. Right? That's crazy talk, right? But if I said, hey, it's going to start raining at exactly this time on this day, 300 years from now, and then it does, well, that's a lot more helpful for me, because no matter, how many years later, 1,000 years later, we can still prove, okay, that gap is large enough that there's no way he could have written it after. He's dead, right? There's no possible way. Now, short-term prophecy is helpful for the people of the time, and specifically in this case, we're going to say the Jews, right? So the Jews would establish a prophet by short-term prophecy, right? So if Ezekiel says something's going to happen in 20 years, and it happens in 20 years, they go, we're alive at this time. We know he said that 20 years ago. It happened. He's a prophet. Now, thousands of years later, we may argue that, he actually wrote it later, whatever, but it helps them, and again, that's fine. But we want something a little more for our purposes. And please don't misunderstand me like trying to dismiss short-term prophecy. That is not at all what I am doing. I'm just saying for our purposes, I want something that's long-term so that I have concrete things to hold on to that people are not going to be able to just dismiss with some really basic arguments. So obviously it must be fulfilled. Future prophecy that hasn't happened yet, not super helpful. I mean, I believe it's going to happen, but it doesn't really help the argument from public forums type space, because, well, it hasn't happened yet. So how can we even know that it's really prophecy? So I think that one's obvious. 4, it must be historically proven, right? So the Bible says it's going to happen, and then history proves that it happens, right? Why? And there are plenty of arguments as to why the Bible itself is historical, right? But again, we're trying to establish the veracity of the Bible. Then we can use even outside sources to prove what the Bible said as prophecy was actually true. So by using those outside sources, we don't get people saying, well, the Bible said it happened. It didn't really happen. Okay, we have evidence, right? Historical evidence, archaeological evidence that proves it did actually happen just as the Bible said. So these are the rules. Now, I would say these are pretty solid rules. In fact, most human beings would say, that's pretty good. That's pretty solid. But the Bible actually goes one step further. So I'm going to pull up my Bible here. Actually, sorry. I'm just going to grab one that's here because usually I have it on the phone there, but I'm using the phone to record. So while I'm pulling this up, I'm going to say, what if I met somebody, right, who gave me 10 prophecies, right, and 9 of those 10 came true? Well, I would say that guy's a prophet. But guess what? The Bible says, nah, one wrong prophecy means everything is false. So you say, wow, that's pretty strict. Yeah, that's more strict than I would be. But let's look at it. So this is Deuteronomy 18. Chapter 18, verses 15 through 19. So I'm going to read this really quickly. So Moses continued, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him, for this is what you yourselves requested of the Lord your God when you were assembled at Mount Sinai. You said, don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore or see this blazing fire, for we will die. In other words, they were respecting God so much, they're like, oh my goodness. Like we can't hear the word of the God directly, or we're just going to die. It's that holy. Then the Lord said to me, what they have said is right. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages the prophet claims on my behalf. And now listen to this. But any prophet who falsely claims to speak in my name or who speaks in the name of another God must die. You may wonder, okay, so this is all the way through verse 22. But you may wonder, how will we know whether or not a prophecy is from the Lord? Right? This is the same question we're trying to answer. Here's how. If that prophet speaks in the Lord's name, but his prediction does not happen or come true, you will know that the Lord did not give that message. So even once, that prophet has spoken without my authority and need not be feared. So this is pretty serious stuff. Like the Bible just takes it even further, which is great because, again, as humans, we may even be accepted the first four and be like, that's good enough. But the Bible's like, no. I see your four and I raise you one better, right? Because that's how serious it is. So let's dig in. In future classes, we're going to deal with a lot more prophecy. So today we really only have time for it's the second prophecy, but I think it's the way that I try to present it is it's the first prophecy that most people don't know about, right? So obviously the first prophecy in the Bible is when they received the curse in Genesis chapter 3. Some people argue that there's other prophecies in there, but I will say that the most widely accepted one is in Genesis 3 when they get the curse. And it says that there will be enmity between the woman and the offspring of the woman, right, and you, and that he will bruise your heel and they crush your head, right? So that's a prophecy, right? Most people agree that's the first prophecy. Most people know about that prophecy, but I'm going to present one that's also very close to the beginning. In fact, it's going to be the second prophecy in the Bible, Genesis chapter 5. Now you say, wait a second, Genesis chapter 5, isn't that genealogy? And you would be correct. That is, in fact, the genealogy. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, and I'm going to read through it really quickly, right? And as I go through it, we're going to see something, right? So a lot of times we just sort of skip over genealogy. We don't think it's super important. But in this case, we might find out that we're wrong. So this is the written account of the descendants of Adam. Okay, so Adam. When God created human beings, he made them to be like himself. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and called them human. When Adam was 130 years old, he became the father of a son who was just like him in his very image. His son's name was Seth. After the birth of Seth, Adam lived another 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Adam lived 930 years, and then he died. When Seth was 105 years old, he became the father of Enosh. After the birth of Enosh, Seth lived another... And I'm going to kind of just skip these parts because they're very repetitive, but I am going to basically read that first part of that section for each one. So when Enosh was 90 years old, he became the father of Canaan, or Kenan. Depending on your translation, that may be spelled Kenan or Kainan. So it's the same name. So when Kenan was 70 years old, he became the father of Mahalalel. Okay? And after that, Mahalalel, when he was 65 years old, he became the father of Jared. All right? When Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of Enoch. Now, this one's a little interesting because Enoch, when he was 65 years old, he became the father of Methuselah, which was the oldest person to ever live. But even cooler than that, after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch lived in close fellowship with God for another 300 years. He had other sons and daughters. Enoch lived 365 years walking in close fellowship with God. And Enoch walked with God and was no more. So Enoch was the first person to not actually die. He just walked with God and was no more. This is pretty cool. But anyway, so now we have Methuselah. So when Methuselah was 187 years old, he became the father of Lamech. So Lamech, right? And so when Lamech was 182 years old, he became the father of a son, Lamech named his son Noah. Okay, now obviously everybody who knows who Noah is, right? So we're going to stop there because this is where the flood comes in, right? So we have these names here, and this is right before, or right up to the time of the flood. So from the beginning of man to the flood. Now, you say, well, why are we presenting these names? Well, this is the cool part, guys. Pay attention and watch this because this is super, super awesome. You see, each of these names has a specific meaning. So, for example, Adam means man. Seth means appointed. Enosh means mortal. Canaan means sorrow. Mahalalel, the blessed God. Jared means shall come down. Enoch means teaching. Methuselah, his death shall bring. Right? And the reason for that is, in case you guys aren't familiar with that, Methuselah dies at the flood. So, quite interesting. Lamech, the despairing. And then Noah means comfort and rest. Now you say, okay, that's interesting. But now let's look over here on the right-hand side, and we're gonna actually read this, and we're gonna find out we have a prophecy here. Man appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down, teaching, and his death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. You see, the Bible is full of God's fingerprints. This is one that I think most people aren't familiar with, right? Like I said, this is the second prophecy of the Bible. The first is widely accepted to be the crushing of the heel, or crushing of the head, bruising of the heel. But this one, not as many people know about, but it is super, super clear. Man appointed mortal sorrow. Sin. But the blessed God shall come down teaching us, and his death shall bring the despairing, that's us, human beings, comfort and rest. This is really cool stuff. I really love this. So in conclusion, right, we established God exists. These are the arguments that we presented ahead of time. Now, in the future classes, let's find out if the Bible is the word of this God. And if it is, then we're gonna have to do something about it. All right? So I appreciate your time, and I thank you for those of you watching online. I appreciate that. And this is, like I said, the first of a series. And there's going to probably be about 15 to 20 in this particular series. So the next time that you'll see a video online will actually be back in Daniel. So for those of you who've sort of been keeping along, where we just finish up with a defense of Daniel, and this is kind of going backwards. So before that ever happened. So thank you for your time, and God bless you guys. And hopefully, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments, or if you are part of City Team, you're more than welcome to come and see me and ask a question. Thanks, guys. God bless you.